Thank you for joining me on the Investing for Freedom podcast. Today, we've got a really interesting and unique guest on the show, and I'll stress unique. Steve Valentine and I have been, friends. I think we met originally in a mastermind with Chris Harder. I think this was 2020, and I've always been curious about the way that Steve thinks about real estate, thinks about investing, but also has built a business around it.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
If you could narrow it down to one thing that has had the greatest impact on your success, what would it be?
The one thing, as bad as this may sound, but it was the death of my father in 2015. One of my coaches that I was working through at the time of my dad's death, I was very upset with how he was handling things and what had gone on. And she told me there's both good and bad things we take away from our parents. And the things that we didn't like, we need to change those and change the generational side. So in 2008, 2015, my dad bought 1,000 homes from the trustee sale of foreclosures for investors. And so when that happened, he was working for them, not with them. And so it kind of changed my mindset. And he didn't really buy anything for himself in that time. He wasn't thinking outside the box with, okay, well, maybe I can borrow some money from some of these guys so I can build my own portfolio. And so he passed unexpectedly at age 63, owning maybe one or two properties, the one that they lived in and one other property that was in the company. But that was it after all of his genius and being in the business 40 years. So that was probably the greatest impact as to, where my business went from there.
It's such an interesting point. And I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here, but you're a real estate agent. You're in the real estate industry. And I've seen this so many times. I mean, even as a real estate investor, it takes a very, very special type of real estate agent to understand investing and to really work with investors. But I'm surprised at how many, real estate agents, business owners, even again, just back to real estate agents that don't understand the asset side, the wealth building side, the cash flow side of the business. And so I think it's just really interesting that, your dad did all that and built all that and did it for everyone else, but didn't do it for himself.
Right. Yeah. And that was back in the times when you could buy 4 walls and a roof for 20 grand, in those days. And we'll never see those days again. But it's like, that's one of my biggest regrets, was not being mindset prepared for the investment side or opportunity. And so one of the things about that, the real estate thing, interesting stat, is that only about 5 to 6% of real estate agents actually own an investment property. And the reason that is because when we go into real estate school, they don't teach us anything about the real estate investing. It looks good, but there's also a lot of myths around it that I don't have the down payment, I don't have the things. And there's all these different house hacks that you can do to get to that point.
One of my early mentors, his name was Barry Liparelli, and he owned a real estate agency. He owned an insurance company. At one point in time, for many years, he was the county assessor. He owned an appraisal office. And from the very beginning, he told me, there's like, if any business that you're going to get into, you want to get into a business that has a low amount of overhead, et cetera. And he told me, insurance, real estate from a broker's perspective, because unless your agents are really selling something, they're not really costing you very much. Right. And it's the same thing with insurance companies. But it's interesting to me. What did you say the stat is? 6 or 7%?
Only 6 to 7% in all the rooms that I've spoke in over the years. Only 6 to 7% of the room owns rental properties.
Man, that is just an insane stat. Why, I've talked to so many people that were like, along the way, they had their awakening. It's almost like the Matrix and the red pill. Like all of a sudden one day, they're doing all this work, like your dad was doing all this work for other people. And I think people either have their awakening where they see, I'm sitting here making all this money for other people and I'm not doing it myself. When was your awakening? Was it?
So it was right after my dad passed. I started to see things because when he got sick, he had terminal cancer for 9 months. And I had to run his business with my mom so that everything was stable when he passed. And I started seeing things and going, well, why would you do all this work for this person at this amount? And one of the investors that he did a lot of business with was very greedy, really treated my dad not great, and always made a lot of promises to my dad. So I started looking at things. I'm like, well, if I can borrow money, just like what this guy is doing, why can't I do some of this for myself? And so that's what we started doing, is we started having conversations with people about lending money. So, typically, an agent will go and find a hard money lender, right? Which is expensive. You got to jump through hoops. You have to have down payments. And so we started raising capital through our clients. So our wealthier clients were willing to lend us money, and we partnered with them. So we would split the profit 50-50, and we would do all the work, and then they would get the return. And the myth for most agents is that I can't, or I don't have the money, or I don't have this or that, and they're not looking at all the other ways that are possible.
So interesting.